Hey, what's up, everybody? It's at the Nerva here. No Brother Robles this week, unfortunately. Y'all need to write to him and tell him to get back in the mix, because he's just doing stuff like taking care of his family, you know. This guy, he's just slacking.
Seriously.
But no, we got two, really important episodes that we wanted to share with you guys. This first one was Sam Say, and then tomorrow we're going to be releasing one with our friends from the New Christian Intellectuals, Cody and Jacob, on the topic of Tim Keller's thoughts on justice, politics, abortion. I would encourage you to please just listen to these two, check out the show notes. I think it's going to be really helpful as you are trying to think through these issues from a biblical perspective. Right now, it can be really difficult. I look up to Tim Keller, but I think he's making some, pretty big mistakes in some of his thinking lately on this topic. So hopefully this will help you like it has helped us to think through this. So enjoy. Well, good afternoon or morning or evening, whenever you're watching or listening to the Free Mind Podcast. Welcome. Excited today. I have Nerva back in tow with me. Ride or die today, but we're with our good friend now. I feel like we're becoming good friends. This has been a regular thing lately with brother Sammy Say. I was thinking, man, you need you might already have one. Do you have a hip hop name?
Yep.
Oh man,
Samuel Say. That already sounds a little bit hip-hop.
So for some reason, when I was in high school, I thought that, for whatever reason, I thought the nickname Thug Dynasty made sense.
Thug Dynasty.
Now, I didn't quite realize that dynasty, I suppose, meant several generations.
Oh, that's funny.
Or at least several incarnations. So I was my own dynasty, and I called myself Thug.
Hilarious.
I like it, man.
Oh man.
You're prophesying all those generations are within.
After him.
That's awesome, man. Well, we got to start out with this post because I don't know, man. This one kind of hit me, but if first of all, if you're not watching, if you're not watching us on YouTube, you're missing out, y'all. Because if you're listening and you have equal ability, go ahead and migrate over to YouTube and watch, because we're gonna be throwing some stuff up there today. But this brother here posted this right here, if you can see it. It's and he said, "How much do I love Sense and Sensibility 1995 version?" Now I'm gonna be honest.
I saw that.
Nerva got me hooked on that thing.
Okay,
my
good.
all-time favorite.
I was worried about where this was going. So now
you're safe. You're good. You're
I'm
safe.
In a safe space then. That's good.
Yes.
I watched it for the first time maybe a couple of years ago, and my goodness, I was hooked. I loved it.
It's awesome.
Yeah, man.
So good.
I never thought I would be a fan. That was one of our first dates. That's how she got me, Sam. I'm gonna be honest, bro. That's how she got me. No, I'm just kidding. She actually ran from me, but I chased her down. But I saw on here your comment. Somebody asked you, "Have you tried the 1995 Pride and Prejudice?" Now I'm gonna tell you right now, that is the truth. Now there is a debate. I don't know which one is your favorite out of the two.
I only know that version.
No. This is Sense and Sense, but Pride and Prejudice, A&E.
No, I like the BBC version.
No, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Pride and Prejudice. But which one do you like better out of this and Pride and Prejudice?
Oh, shucks. That's a tough one.
It's good,
It's
man.
not, Pride and Prejudice is like a few, it's
episodes. Got like 6 episodes or something
and that
like
one's like,
on the A&E version. But anyways, you need to run, don't walk, you know what I'm saying?
Because I've seen Pride and Prejudice, but I've seen the feature film with Keira Knightley, I think.
Yeah, that's not even Pride and Prejudice.
That's what I heard. So I had no idea. I read the book. So, okay, I'll check it out then.
It's so good. It's classic. It's become one of our faves.
I'm a sucker for those kind of movies. I love that stuff. So
yeah, man.
Every once in a while, I guess Thug Dynasty likes some romantic period films. So
no, for sure. Well, you've redeemed yourself from the Backstreet Boys thing. So we'll move on today. But no, I'm excited, man. We kind of got a heavy topic today, so we're going to be talking a little bit about Tim Keller, and it's kind of a bitter thing for me because I've never read a lot of Keller's works over the years, but I have respected him kind of from afar. And so, I've liked the fact that as a pastor, he dealt with worldview issues. He would, do this critical thinking. He would engage the cultural issues of the day. but I never really dove into it for whatever reason. I heard about the reason of God and knew that material, so I never read it. But I did use one of his books when I was doing young adult ministry, teaching on vocation and labor, and I found it to be pretty helpful. But I was noticing some of the stuff. It was an article, I think it was written in 2018 in New York Times, where he was kind of, I keep trying to think of a word. Maybe you can help me think of the word. Thankfully, he was arguing against being apolitical, but then he kind of gave I don't know if it's ambidextrous political, like ambipolitical viewpoint, where he was trying to say because there's no neat fit, basically, you can Christianly vote in any direction, which I thought was a pretty bad argument. But I started noticing a lot of the things he was saying. I was like, man, that on the surface, it's not ringing true. But on the other hand, I had known Keller to be what I thought to be a reliable thinker, scholar. So I began to dive in the last few weeks. And as I've taken a deeper dive, I've kind of like sadly seen, I guess, maybe a lot of chinks in his intellectual armor, at least in this area. And so I've seen a lot of stuff that I would typically not think someone of his caliber would make these kinds of mistakes. I understand none of us get it right across the board. We all have theological errors. We all, miss it in some areas. But some of his arguments, I found them to be not just mistaken, but like obviously mistaken. And so anyways, you put a tweet up a couple weeks ago that I saw, and it was a response to one of his tweets, which said, talking about oppression, justice, etc., doesn't make one a Marxist. It makes one a student of the Bible. So you retweeted that and you wrote, sir, a Marxist premise and a Marxist solution on oppression and justice with some out of context Bible verses is still Marxism. So we're going to be talking about that today. That was a nice little soft tweet you threw there, but I thought it was actually really fitting. And I believe one of the articles that had come out surrounding kind of those tweets was this one we're going to be talking through today, called A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory. Now, some of the responses to you were, hey, how could you say that? He explicitly denounces and rejects Marxism and critical theory. And in fact, this article, in the very title of it, he's saying that he's rejecting it in favor of biblical justice. So how can you say Marxist premises, Marxist conclusions? You must not be reading his stuff. But it's actually, I think, in reading his stuff that it reveals what you said to be true. And that's why I want to walk through this today. Anything you want to say before we jump into the details of this article?
I appreciate that. As I said earlier, I called myself a thug dynasty when I was recently. I was able to connect with one of my high school friends, and she's like, Sam, you're blogging now? You actually sound kind of smart.
I like that, kind of. I love it.
Yeah.
Like keep you on the ground, right?
Exactly. But she's saying that because I was nowhere near, and I'm not an intellectual. I was a very poor student. I didn't graduate from high school. I didn't take school seriously. I was very frustrating to my teachers because they would always say, like, Sam, you have potential, but like you just don't care. That's a whole different story. It wasn't until I became a Christian that I started to care about the world around me and wanting to make the best use of whatever God has given me. But I say all that to say that I recognize that I'm not, I blog, but I'm not an intellectual. I love reading intellectuals. I love, my library is all full of just, brilliant men, that I'm trying to learn from. And one of those people is actually Tim Keller. I've read The Reason for God, and he's a brilliant man. He knows his stuff. So I am not going to pretend I am even 5% anywhere near as intelligent as he is, because I'm not. I never will be. And on top of that, I also know that I'm not going to be as godly as he is. I'm just not. I know myself, and anyone who knows me knows I'm very sinful. And if I were to become 15% as godly as he is, I would be ecstatic. Now, God is able to do that and more. But that would be incredible grace, which I suppose you cannot disbelieve, because God can do all things. Nevertheless, I just know myself, and I know of him, and I know his reputation and everything else. And I chose my words very carefully, and I meant it, and I stand by it. But I say that because I don't want, for myself, I don't, and for others, I don't want there to be this perception that I think I can match him. I can't even match you guys. You guys are much smarter than I am.
No,
but don't
let that statement fall to the ground. I almost don't believe your testimony, but that's powerful and encouraging.
No, but I honestly, I'll be honest with you, I'm always thinking, okay, one of these interviews, they will realize I'm a fraud. They will realize, just keep me blogging. Just let me shut up and just keep blogging where I can edit and do all that, you know. But
that's the name of your first album is I Just Don't Care, and the name of your second album is Give Me Oil in My Lamp, Keep Me Blogging. I don't change. That's pretty good. Sorry, go ahead.
That's pretty good. But I say all that because, like you, I've been following really evangelicals for the last several years, and including Tim Keller, some of the things he's been saying. And I recognize that he's a godly man and he's a intelligent man, but on this issue here, he's very dangerously and I would say even destructively wrong. Mm. And my response was actually to clarify why some would say that he's saying Marxist things, because in the original tweet that you mentioned, he says that talking about oppression and justice isn't Marxism. We all agree with that.
Right.
That is, that sounds like a red herring. Like, that's not what people are saying. Because I'm talking about justice and oppression, but no one will call me a Marxist, right? There's nothing.
Now, real quick, sorry to keep interrupting you. We like to breaking it down for the audience. Red herring, just in case, you know, we don't learn our logical fallacies anymore. It was a kind of bird, right? They threw out on the side that was like to get the dogs off the trail, off the scent. So in other words, explain that terminology with what you're talking about.
Yeah, basically it's something that distracts from the real point. All right. It's something that doesn't, you know, it might be intentional. Usually it's intentional, but it may not be intentional, where it is not, you know, it's something that distracts from the original point. So when people are talking about Marxism, they're not saying you can't talk, they're not saying that Tim Keller can't talk about oppression or justice. What they're saying is how you are defining and talking about justice and oppression is from a Marxist view. And for him to say that distracts from the original point. So, which goes back to my tweet, which I know we'll talk about more, but I say I was careful to use, I wasn't calling him a Marxist necessarily. Right. I was saying that what people are saying is that there is a Marxist premise and there is a Marxist solution. And there are others, and I would say, unfortunately, including him, who have used some text, Bible verses out of context to give, at the very least, a legitimacy, in their mind anyways, to some Marxist thinking. And that was the basis behind my tweet.
Yeah. No, and I think you're exactly right. That's the importance. And that's what I found to be a little bit troubling, because I believe he knows that. Like, he knows the importance of definitions. And the fact that those words have been expressly and explicitly redefined in the academic world and trickled down already now to the place of the common man, that they already are loaded with Marxist baggage, unless you explicitly point that out from the start of the conversation. And I do think you're right. When he gets more explicit, there does seem to be some elements that, in the way that justice is defined, that are coming, or at least impregnated with the Marxist view of justice. So anyways, I think it might be helpful at this point to jump into that article. There are other, for somebody else looking into this topic, you know, I think he wrote a book in the early 2000s on biblical justice.
I think it's called Generous Justice, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you know, he's also, like I said, written a lot of articles and put out a lot of tweets lately clarifying, and I think it's crystallizing. One person said to me recently, they're like, man, I kind of like that you can't pin Keller down, you know, he'll surprise you. And I thought, you know, at the time I thought, yeah, that might be the case. And sometimes that can be a good thing, intellectual honesty. and maybe not being too kind of intellectually partisan in your thinking where you could predictable a mile away. But I will say this, the more I've looked into Keller, he actually is predictable. Once you understand where he's coming from, I think he's pretty consistent in his views. Yeah, you got something there?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think the best word at times that I would use to describe Mr. Keller, again, with all due respect to him, is that he is vague. And when someone is vague, it's, to me, only two possibilities. You're vague either because of ignorance or you're vague deliberately.
Jeez Louise.
So you have to make the choice there. I don't think he's ignorant. He's a very, very intelligent man, as I said. So then what's the other option?
Yeah.
And it's what concerns me. And I hate saying that. I hate it. I don't like it. But, I want to share that, I want to be honest with myself and the audience. And as you said, I've read and seen other, we'll probably talk about it later on, but there's been he's had some panel discussions in circular environments, and there've been some pretty pointed questions asked that you would hope that a prominent pastor would be able to shed biblical reasoning and biblical insight into that environment. And it seemed to be, there was vague answers to those questions. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So, basically, and I do, some of those you've probably seen and we haven't. So I'd love, as we get through this, for you to bring those up. But in this article, he starts out, just give a quick sketch. He talks about the problem we face, and he asks the question, which justice? And I think that's exactly the right question. Like, how are we, what should our definition as Christians be of justice? How do we define that? And how does it compare and contrast to the quote unquote worldly or secular ideas or definitions of justice? So he asks that. Then he lays out his, quick thing of biblical justice here. And he talks about the history of justice, the traditions. And you can pause me at any point if you want to speak into any of these, if you have any thoughts, but just wanted to rush through these. The history of justice, he talks about the Enlightenment tradition and how the tendency there was to try to find justice without relying on God or without a theology or without theism. Although I would say, we were just recently talking to a historian that really knows this well, and he thought, for instance, John Locke was actually very much theologically informed and drawing many of his political conclusions on the basis of theology. But just for sake of discussion, we'll just accept the premise here that Locke and Hume were basically trying to give a godless philosophy of justice. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had Marx. Unless you want to respond to any of that so far.
Very quickly. Now, this is where my memory could be failing me, but I would imagine that in some form, Locke was influenced by the Magna Carta, which was very much, which is basically, the British built their human rights thinking on the Magna Carta, and that was very much theistic. So that right there, I would disagree with that. And then very quickly, that's when he probably gets into libertarianism, which I'll admit I'm a libertarian. So I was like, you're not quite precise in that. Now, I'm not completely loyal necessarily to libertarianism, which is, to me, my reasoning for it is that I think in some cases it's based on a biblical point of view. In other cases, it's more based on a practical point of view. So it's not something that I think the Bible affirms in every single area.
Sure.
Yeah. But anyway, I think even with that, I would say, actually, I thought he was much harshest against libertarianism than he was to Marxism, which I found interesting. Because libertarianism, like I said, I don't think it's inherently sinful by any means. Right. I think it's actually a very biblical argument for it, which we can get to later on as well. But I thought it was interesting that he was harsher against libertarianism, but then not as quite as harsh with Marxism or collectivism.
Sure. And spot on with that. I would agree. So, basically though, this section where he's given the history of justice, and he would admit this too, it's a short, truncated, so he's probably oversimplifying. I think in that oversimplification though, there would be a good discussion that would need to be had is, the different streams of the Enlightenment, and the fact that some of them, like Locke, were arguing from a maybe at least a theistic perspective, and other ones like Hume and Marx were not, and explicitly so. And do those have any implications for the view you end up with? And I think he probably flattened that out a little bit too much here. Then he talks about the problem of foundations. Now, this I think you would agree. I don't know your views on this topic, but he basically says, for the Enlightenment project, it was doomed from the start. When you get rid of God, you lose your objective moral foundation. So therefore, there is nothing to argue for any kind of objective universal justice, no basis to do that, no foundation.
That was the best part of the article, I thought. That was you.
Me too. Yeah, I thought that was well done. Now, here's where I want to kind of dig in with you for a minute, because here's the essence, I think, of what he's trying to do. And he gives a brief outline of biblical justice, a brief outline. So here's where he's going to give his model. And then he's going to compare this to what he thinks are the secular views of justice and critique those on the basis of this. And he does make a note that, I guess, forthcoming is an article where he's going to give this in more detail in the future. And maybe he'll clarify some of the stuff we're going to talk about, but I think there's some immediate problems in here. So number one here, it says community. Others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. Others, I see Brother Sammy is smiling.
I'm smiling because we've been hitting on the exact same notes. That's exactly one of my biggest concerns with it too. So
Yep. And
if you agree with me, you're clearly very discerning. So
listen, I must be walking in it, bro. No, but and we so just so our listeners know, we haven't talked with Sammy about this at all. We're just coming into this fresh and going through it. But I was talking with Nerva about this today. So listeners, I want you to pay attention to this as we read it. Pull this article up. You can find it in the show notes. We'll have it down there by faith. It'll be there. So what he's saying here, others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. He's saying this is tenet one of a biblical view of justice. So you ought to be thinking, okay, what are his reasons for drawing this conclusion? The first thing he quotes, he said, the Bible depicts the human world as profoundly interrelated community. So the godly must live in such a way that the community is strengthened. Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke puts all the teaching on, quote, the righteous, unquote, in the book of Proverbs into a concise and practical principle. And he says this, the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. So I asked Nerva earlier, because we're just practicing the stuff, practicing analyzing, because you want to analyze everybody in terms of the Bible. So we said, okay, does that give any evidence that others have a claim on my wealth? And look at that language. And maybe the rest of this, go ahead, Sam. I don't want to take up all the airtime here, but what are your thoughts so far on this argument that he's giving there?
Yeah, his evidence doesn't back up his claim. That's one thing that I was very curious, because I thought, even though I had some small disagreements with everything leading up to that point in the article, I thought, okay, this is pretty good. Generally so far until that point, I thought, no. There is, how do I say it? There is a claim on my money, but it's not other people. It's God, because it's not my money. That's the issue there. Like, God is the one. I'm a steward of his money. Nobody has a claim to my money because it's not my money. It's God's money, and I am to steward it or to use it in a way that honors Him. And then that's where the Bruce Waltke, quote comes in, where I am absolutely to voluntarily bless my neighbors. That's a command, but it's not because of them, it's because of God, right? So I am to bless others voluntarily. So for example, even in the church, in the local church, I voluntarily give to the church to bless the elders, to bless the deacons, to bless myself within the church, to bless everybody else in the church, to bless the community. That's is if I voluntarily do that by agreeing to join the church, but that's in obedience to God. But nobody has a claim to my money. And when you say that, you are already in a very dangerous path, which I'm assuming we'll get to that probably too. So I was just maybe, unless you have more questions or.
No, that's good. That's good. That's exactly right. And I think what you pointed out, which he does, the interesting part is he says, others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. The voluntary part fits. It's the claim and the must based on a claim that others have rather than, and I told Nerva, I said, I think you could adjust that point by saying God has a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. But that would change a lot of his approach, I think, if he were to change that. Did you have something to add to that?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's one point that I forgot to mention, which is if others have a claim to my money, then it's not voluntary for me to give it to them.
Exactly.
There you go.
They have a claim, they have a right to it.
Exactly.
Right.
So here's an example. We have a family member who lives in the south side of Chicago, so they got cameras up to guard their stuff. Well, Joker came in, took their stuff. He found this guy on the street 3 days later with his stuff.
True.
And went and took it back.
True story.
Now we all know that was right because it was his. Now that guy, even if that guy needed it, and even if he had extra, it wasn't. That guy didn't have a claim on that. If that guy had a claim on that, then he would be wrong to take it back, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that it's pretty straightforward and commonsensical, but scriptural as well. The only part I wanted to ask you about, because this is one that I think, at least on the surface, sometimes carries more weight with people, and that's the gleaning laws. He mentions the gleaning laws. What would your response be to that? Does that show maybe that others have a claim on our wealth?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think in the article, I'm forgetting exactly, it's been a while since I read the article, but I think he even points out that they are gleaning. It's like you are helping them work.
Right. He does.
They're living. Marxism.
Gleaning was hard, apparently. Gleaning was difficult from what I hear.
That is not quite the same thing as you having a claim to my money. First of all, it's God who's commanding. It's part of the Mosaic law, right? God is commanding all of Israel, the wealthy anyways, to fund somebody's work, to fund them. That is not what Marxism teaches. So I guess if you don't mind, let's actually kind of go back a little bit to maybe what he teaches. I think that might be helpful. Because I think, you know what, because one of the things too that I hear is oftentimes people, when they hear the word Marxism, they don't quite, I think, understand sometimes what it means. And then they think, well, Keller isn't a Marxist. And you know what, I would say, you know what, in a sense, Keller isn't a Marxist, or what he's saying, in a sense, isn't Marxist. But that's because, so generally, to make it very simple, Marxism is the idea that history, history of the world is made up of the oppressor and the oppressed, and not just that, but that they're in a conflict with each other throughout all times. Especially now, remember that Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, or all his ideas within right after the Industrial Revolution, where you had all these guys who had been farmers and everything else, and then now the whole world is changing. They're now in the industrial age, and they find themselves working very long hours for very, very little pay. But yet, meanwhile, you have now all these people, the factory owners, who are just now very, very wealthy. And you see that in this new age, the factory worker isn't making a lot of money and then is living in very horrible conditions. So Marx sees that, and he says, this is just the new incarnation, the new version of a history of conflict between two people, the oppressor and the oppressed. Then, more than that, Marxism is very important. Within Marxism, he then says that eventually there'll be a class consciousness on the part of the factory worker, or the proletariat, or the oppressed, the underprivileged. And they'll recognize that the bourgeoisie, or the upper class, or the privileged class, are oppressing them. They will rise up and they will have a revolution, and they will now they will against the privileged class, and then they will have they will be able to control the means of production, and they will have a greater power, and that they will then be able to balance it all and then really just take power for themselves. And then there will be a communism, which will then create a stateless society where now everyone, where this is where the quote comes from, everyone according to their ability and everyone according to their need.
Right.
Which sounds kind of similar to I have a claim to your wealth, right? So that is what classical Marxism, I'm breaking it down in very simple terms, but that's generally what it is. So it's one historical, economic, theoretical, philosophical, and also somewhat prophetic, right? Because Marx claims that this will happen, that there will be a revolution. It never happened. The revolutions that did end up happening were not from the factory workers and the oppressed. It was just from political elites who wanted to use, who just became fascist through communism. But my point is, even within that, you have different kinds of Marxism. So you had the Marx or the Marxist Leninist Marxism, which is, or communism, that's the Russian or the Soviet Union type. You have Maoism, which is Marxist, but yet the Chinese version. You have Western Marxism, which ended up fueling critical theory. So you have all these different kinds of Marxism. You could, so and some could say, well, the Chinese, they're not really Marxist. Fidel Castro, they're not really Marxist. Venezuela, because they all have different versions, and because they've not really been able to create the communist states, the real communist, the class, the stateless and classless society that Marx envisioned. That's because it's impossible. Marx did not understand human nature, that people are just oppressive. They will just use anyone they can. Nevertheless, I say all that because Tim Keller would generally not be pushing what Marx is, what Marx believed. However, the real core aspect of Marxism is conflict theory. That is the very basis, the heart of Marxism. The idea that there is an oppressed class and a oppressor class oppressing them, right? And it's really based on a disparity of power. Right? And that's really what it comes down to. That's why critical theory, they all admit this. Now they're trying to walk back on it. That's why Black Lives Matter says there are a Marxist group, even though they're not quite the same thing. They wouldn't quite hold to the exact same thing that Karl Marx would believe. That's because they have the very basic core elements of Marxism, that being the conflict theory, that there is groups of people, whether it's gender, race, class, whatever it is, that are always going to be at war with each other. And the only way to solve that is to create parity, which can only happen essentially naturally if you try to establish a socialist state. With all that being said, now I'm forgetting the main reason why
Well, and before we jump on it, again, I wonder if you could help us with this. If not, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but some people have called BLM a Maoist version of Marxism. Do you know why that is? What's particular about Maoism that matches that than the other kind of Marxisms?
That's a good question. Now, this is one where I will say I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's particularly because Black Lives Matter. They're very friendly to the Chinese Communist Party. And then also one of the things too possibly is in some ways China, I mean, this probably could be, I mean, maybe it's more to that, I don't know, but China is probably the best example of communism, which is that they've opened up their economy slightly, where in a sense now they're more of a state capitalist nation, where they're very authoritarian, but they know that they cannot survive without a form of capitalism. So they've opened up quite a little bit, which is very similar in a sense to democratic socialism that Bernie and AOC are teaching, where you essentially vote for your oppressor. But I'm assuming that's it. But other than that, I wouldn't know the finer details as to why that's the case.
That makes sense. And I noticed that somebody said they have cleaned up their language a little bit too on their website just recently and changed it because of the pushback. People have been recognizing who they are. And so now they're trying to hide it a little bit more. But I think the reason we dove into that, because we were talking about the Gleaning laws and just under having a claim to the wealth.
Yes. Okay. The Gleaning laws, they were not, it wasn't that you deserve somebody else's money. It wasn't a, I guess I was put this way. I always struggle with this kind of word sometimes, but a redistribution of wealth. That's not
Right.
which Keller has in other places advocated for.
Right.
It's more of being able to fund somebody else to be able to work, right? And it's not that dissimilar to the temple tax, where God instructed that the Israelites would pay a tax to support the work of the priest and the temple. So Marxism is not about helping somebody work. It's about giving someone money because it's their right. That's not quite the same thing as that.
Yeah, sure. So I think you made two good points there. Again, gleaning doesn't give evidence for the fact that others have a claim on our wealth.
Yeah.
And it was also the God's claim on our wealth that he told us how to set up a system where people could work, poor people to work to gain stuff that doesn't match socialism. So if you use this for anything, it can't be for that. You have to think about that contextually, and then make an analogy to what would that look like today to help fund other people's work, which would be nothing like what you might draw from this. So let's move forward here. So he does admit, he said, nevertheless, it is not to be confiscated. You are to acknowledge the claim and voluntarily be radically generous. And he does admit also, he said, because this is, I thought this was a non sequitur, but he said, because God owns all your wealth and you are just a steward of it, the community has some claim on it.
Interesting.
That to me seems to be the leap he keeps making without the connection. What do you think about that?
I completely agree with you. If it's because God is the one who has a claim to our wealth, we are only obligated to do what the Bible calls us to do.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean. So I'm not committed to a community. I'm committed to the Word of God. And what God calls me to do is what I should do, what I should love to do, and I should. Now, again, the key thing is you can voluntarily give. You can choose to give all your money away. That's fine, but biblically, you are not commanded to do that. And the issue here too is, of course, we know that when you say the community has a claim to that, what you're really saying the government has a claim to that, and that is not what the Bible says. In fact, in the Old Testament, the prophet Samuel. Samuels tend to be very wise. No, the prophet Samuel, I believe when the Israelites wanted a king, he said, you want a king? Well, just know he will tax you more than 10% or up to 10%. Why is that significant? Well, who else was getting 10%? It was supposed to be for the priestly work. Right? So it's I find it funny that it's not funny, but I find it concerning that we are ignoring the very clear teachings of what the Bible is saying about these things. And then, as you said, he will make a point about God owning or God having a claim to our wealth, but then he will, without showing exactly how he got to this point, move directly into, well, this means that the community has a claim to our wealth, and that's not true at all. And if that's true, then how does that apply to abortion, for example, right? Like, so right now in Canada, I know in the States, you guys have a similar law, except it's gone through, I mean, I'm referring to, I forget what it's called, I'm referring to the, how government funding goes to Planned Parenthood, but not so they can kill babies, quote unquote, but just so that they can do other healthcare work, which makes, I mean, they're using that money to kill babies, but legally, I think there's some kind of way for them to try to avoid claiming that they are really using that money to kill babies. But anyway, here in Canada, that money goes directly into killing babies. Now I know, although hopefully you can talk about that at some point too, but I know that Keller, of course, hates abortion. I recognize that, although he has some concerning views as to how we Christians should respond to that. Nevertheless, if you said they have a claim to my wealth or to my money, well then, for what, right? What does that mean, and to what degree? Because the world would say the same thing, and they would say that includes killing babies. Then what is the argument that you would use to say, well, no, not for killing babies? Now, of course, he hates abortion. But then if you said they have a claim to my money, then you already have then given yourself a basis to be vulnerable to that kind of argument from the world.
Ooh, so good.
Again, yeah, that leap from God has a claim to they have a claim is really interesting. And I think I heard this recently, but they were quoting him. They said at one point, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but to not give to the poor is robbery. And that again goes to what's called the need-based theory of justice, that they have a claim to your money. And if it is robbery, it's hard to say, well, why shouldn't the government get involved? Because normally we'd think, man, if somebody robs you, that's where the justice system should enter and bring judgment, bring restitution, whatever needs to happen. So if that literally is robbery, if they literally have a claim, I think he's trying to say, well, that doesn't necessitate government involvement. But that becomes a difficult position, I think, to argue if it is in fact their claim.
One of the frustrating things is that for a lot of and honestly, we in Canada, we're already well past you guys when it comes to this issue. But right. America, I think you guys seem to be gravitating towards this issue that I want to mention right now, which is when we Christians these days oftentimes talk about justice or helping the poor. First of all, there's two errors. We think we're supposed to solve poverty. We're not called for that.
That's a good point.
Christ says that the poor you will always have with you. We're not going to solve that. Does that mean we shouldn't care? No, because the Bible is very clear. We should care, and so we should help the poor. But through what means? Now, the individual can do whatever he pleases in a way that is not, of course, against Scripture. But we forget that when God talks about helping the poverty or helping people who are in poverty, it is not necessarily about political work. I think we're kind of lazy on that. It's about the church's role in society, that we, the church, are supposed to be using our offering and our tithing to support and help the poor. But we now think, no, it's not the local church's job. It's now the government's job to be doing it. So we are now shifting our role to the world, now to the government, who don't have a good idea as to what justice really is. They don't know what they're doing. We do. We should know because we have the word of God. But instead, we're making God's word about a local church or the local church's role into some kind of a fiscal policy, which is not what it was originally intended for. God didn't call us to beg the government to help the poor, but he calls us, for us, the church, to help the poor.
Yeah. That's good. And speaking of how to do that, he ends this first point with this. He says this view of property, he's terming the biblical view, does not fit well with either a capitalist or a socialist economy. And to me, he hasn't argued that. He's just asserting, obviously it doesn't fit good with the socialist economy if biblically, for instance, you say thou shalt not steal, that implies personal ownership of property. And so you can draw those conclusions, but he hasn't really shown how it doesn't fit with capitalism, because on everything he mentioned here, capitalism wouldn't say either way. It would just say you own what you earn. And then I think God's word, like you said, when you submit to God's word as a Christian, it would say even in a capitalist system, because we owe our claim to him, we do what he says and we give generously out of that. But that seems to presuppose at least some type of capitalism. I don't know if he has some third economic option in mind, but what are your thoughts on that last phrase?
Sorry, would you be able to help me remember what he's referring to when he says?
Yeah, so he's talking about this view, the view that others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily, does not fit well with either a capitalist or a socialist economy.
I suppose. Well, the issue with it is because he's being inconsistent. That's why you can't put it into either group. It's neither capitalistic or socialistic, because his wording there or premise is inconsistent, or I would say, with all due respect, incoherent. Again, if someone has a claim or a right to your money or to your property, then it's not voluntary.
Right.
So
It's incoherent. It's very wording.
exactly. So, but if the center of that, if the heart of that, of his wording there is a claim, then it really is actually socialistic. Because if somebody has a claim to my property, then it means then that I have to absolutely give it to them, which then ends up becoming socialistic. So, but again, you can only identify that if you can strip some of the, again, I'm not trying to be, disrespectful, but some of the incoherent wording within his article.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about that till you just said it, but in essence, he is trying to square the circle with his wording. And that's why it doesn't fit in either category, because these two are mutually exclusive and his own wording is mutually exclusive. So anyways, no, that's good, man. So some of these will go a little faster, but this second one, he talks about equity. He said, everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. And again, I think the big word there that if you're doing your Columbo questions at home is, what do you mean by equally? And that's going to be important, because you could walk away from this thinking, especially combined with some of his other writings, that he's going to be talking about something along the lines of social justice. Now, he doesn't necessarily commit himself to that in this segment, I don't think. But really briefly, I'll just, he talks about Leviticus 24:22, you are to have the same law for the foreigner as for the native born. And basically, he's talking about equal treatment under law, which we would agree with, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so the last thing, and just because we're running a little bit behind, I won't read all these. Maybe I will read them, but this part was the part I thought, it just kind of was misleading. So he said, another example of inequity is unfair business practices. Leviticus 19:13 and Deuteronomy 24:14 through 15 speak of unfair wages. Now, I think many people will read that and they'll automatically think unfair wages, disparities between men and women, or disparities between whites and blacks. That's kind of the context, or minimum wage laws. So it'll give you that feeling like, oh, this is what the Democrats care about, so I can care about that because that's biblical. I just want to pull up these verses real quick and get your thoughts on these. But here's the verses he referenced. Leviticus 19:13. You must not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages due a hired hand must not remain with you until morning. So if you're listening to that at home, you'll notice that has nothing to do, if you were given to thinking maybe, because he doesn't write these, he just writes the scripture references. So, chances are you might gloss by. And I'm not saying he did this maliciously, but every one of these scriptures he listed, none of them have to do with really what I would term unfair wages. It's simply, telling them not to oppress people by withholding the wages they promised them. Exactly. It says nothing about the amount of wages, if that's what you were thinking. Absolutely. So then the next one.
Mind if I quickly?
No, go ahead. It
reminds me of the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where
yes,
one of the you guys had to talk about that before or something? Or
we did, but say it again.
Oh, okay. And I'm forgetting the parable here, but essentially I think you have this group of people who I think have been working in this vineyard for maybe several hours, and they get paid a certain amount. And then you have another person who I think works for only an hour or something like that. And the master decides to give him the same amount of money as he was everybody else. Am I remembering things correctly here?
Yep.
Okay. And then the other guys who've been working there for several hours come and complain, saying, wait a minute, we've been working here for all this time, and this person comes for about an hour, and here you are giving them the same pay. And then the master says, I can give them whatever basically I want to, because it's my money, I'm deciding. Like I said, I'm paraphrasing things. It's been a while. It was kind of dangerous or risky to mention it, But the point is, it's on the person. Like when you choose to work for someone, it's a contract. He chooses the value of the work. It's up to him. If you think it's unfair, biblically, that would actually be sinful. It's not, because they choose the value, and then you choose to see if your work is, they choose the value of the job, and then you choose if that's worth it for you.
Right.
If afterward you have accepted that agreement, and you complain about it, that's sin, because then you're being ungrateful and then you're not, appreciating God's gift in that manner. So the idea about unfair wages, if someone is in his heart doing it in a greedy fashion where he knows that particular job is worth more than what he's given them, then that's sinful. Nevertheless, generally, if the say, for example, the factory owner believes that the salary he's giving to the factory workers is reasonable, if he believes that, and then the factory workers decide to agree on a contract and they work for that, that is not an injustice. That's not unfair wages. It's up to both parties to choose what's fair for them. And that's the agreement, that's the contract. So when we say unfair wages, what does that mean? It does biblically, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It becomes a matter of subjective reasoning. And then you start to say that that's an injustice. Then you say that the master in that parable then is now an evil master. That would be the implication, which really then is really, of course, a parable about Christ. Then you end up calling Christ an evil, unjust master himself, because he decides what's right and good for us. We don't decide that for him.
Oh my.
That's an excellent point. We interviewed Dr. Larry Reed. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he wrote a book called Was Jesus a Socialist? And he uses that exact parable to show sometimes people use that to think that he was promoting socialism. He said it's the exact opposite, actually. He has the ability to freely choose what to offer the guys, and they choose to work for it or not. And in this case, I think you're exactly right. If you talk about, if by unfair wages you mean the disparity in what they were getting paid per hour, that person actually, that wasn't unfair at all. To call it unfair is to call that person in the parable unfair, which is in turn to call Jesus unfair, because he seemed to prop that person up as just in that case. But yeah, so these verses that he puts here, the second one was Deuteronomy 24:14-15 says, do not oppress a hired hand who is poor or needy, whether one of your brothers or one of the foreigners residing within a town in your land. You are to pay him his wages each day before the sun sets, because he is poor and depends on them. Otherwise, he will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be held guilty. Again, this has nothing to do with the amount paid. This has to do with paying him like you said you would pay him, on time, the amount you said you would pay him. And then the last one, he actually he wrote Amos 6:5-6, but I think he meant Amos 8 because that didn't seem to be the right passage. But it's the same thing here. Where it's talking about they took the wheat, they reduced the measure while increasing the price, and cheat with dishonest scales, and said we can buy the poor with silver and the needy with a pair of sandals, and even sell the chaff. So they were being dishonest in this case of what they were actually selling, which again, the unfair wages thing, to term it like that, to me just seemed like intentional misleading by using that language. Yeah. And that was it. So that, I think you walk away from that number 2 point, equity, and that everyone must be treated equally with dignity. And you might think, oh man, we got to work for equal wages, minimum wage laws, stuff like that. And it has absolutely nothing to do with that. Any last comments on that point before we move to the next one?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned all of that. I mean, if I always get back to this point, if minimum wage, was justice. Now, if someone wants to argue about what's better practically, that's one thing.
Right.
Well, although I will say, given that parable I mentioned, it would be I think it's an injustice to force a business owner to pay someone a certain amount. But that's perhaps a different conversation. But yeah, I mean, in the Mosaic law, God gives us the very foundation of justice. So when you're saying something that's contrary to Mosaic law, then you're the one in the wrong, not God. And unfortunately, he's saying things here, or he's implying things here that is contrary to the Mosaic law. Sure.
And this one I really want to get your input on. Number 3, corporate responsibility. He says, he said, I am sometimes responsible for and involved in other people's sins.
Yeah.
And so he gives the examples here, and I don't know if you want to comment to one by one, but we'll just start with this one. He says, corporate responsibility. Achan's family, Joshua 7, did not do the stealing, but they helped him become the kind of man who would steal. And if you don't know this passage, if you're listening, I think it was where he took something, they were in war, and he took something from one of the tents. They weren't supposed to take any treasure or anything from the war, and he did it, and they ended up they killed him and his family as part of the Mosaic Law. And I think he's using this as basically sometimes we're held corporately responsible. He also gives the Daniel 9, where Daniel repents for sins committed by his ancestors, even though there's no evidence he personally participated in them. 2 Samuel 21, where God holds Israel responsible for injustices done to the Gibeonites by King Saul. And then one last one here where he says in 1 Samuel 15:2 and Deuteronomy 23:3-8, where he holds members of the current generation of a pagan nation responsible for the sins committed by their ancestors many generations before. And the 3 reasons why are corporate responsibility, corporate participation, and institutionalized sin. Thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I don't remember every single, and help me going forward, but with Achan, so using that, let's just start with that example. It doesn't say anything, it doesn't say that the family was responsible for his sin. It just means that they suffered the consequences of his sin, which is not new. We like this is something you see throughout in our world today, or even throughout the Bible, where it doesn't say that. In fact, the Bible is very clear that God will not visit the sins of the fathers on the children, meaning he will not blame the child or the children for their father's sins. And I mean, and if that's the case, then, right? So my father, for example, was abusive towards my mom. Am I guilty of that? Do I need to repent to my mom for that? Right? That's not biblically how it works. And then with Daniel, now again, I've not read all these, but from just going from maybe a little of my memory, and correct me if you're I'm sure you're more familiar with it than I am right now. But Daniel was a prophet, where he's as a prophet, you're representing your nation or the covenant, you say, in a unique manner. Where now I don't know if he was himself guilty of that sin as well, but even if he wasn't, as a leader or as someone who was representing the nation of Israel within that covenant, it is not. He's not saying he himself is responsible for that, but that he's representing the nation of Israel that's responsible for that sin. That's not quite the same thing as me as an individual being responsible for another individual's sin.
So good.
No, I think that's true. So, it would be, I would love to, if you get a chance to write an article down the road just on corporate responsibility and dig into each of these passages in detail. And I think, you could probably subcategorize it. Some of it is Israel, and there's covenantal representative, there's federal headship at times. And I think failing to make those distinctions and just drawing this broad conclusion that, God held people responsible for other people's sins because they were part of some group doesn't seem to follow. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, and I'm actually planning on writing an article about it at some point, because I know he wrote an article about for Desiring God, where he expanded on this stuff in a much more broad sense. But then also, I mentioned to you earlier that there was a panel discussion between him and Brian Stevenson, and he mentioned that very same that idea as well, but he put it right in terms of white people apologizing or repenting, much like the BT had said a couple of years ago, for other white people's sins. That, which is why he mentions the corporate responsibility aspect. I'm trying to be careful. How do I say it? That is a shocking statement from a pastor. First of all, there's so many theological problems within that. Are we then saying, like, you see, the issue with corporate responsibility is that it tends to put it focuses on apologizing or repenting to other members instead of to God, which seems to me that it's an admission that you recognize that you're not really responsible for that sin. Because if I'm guilty of a sin because of somebody else who's like me, which I'll get to in a second, then that means then that when I go to God God is going to hold me accountable for that sin, which is preposterous. The Bible doesn't say that. I'm guilty for my own sin. More than that, the premise is because somebody else who was white may have sinned, you as a white person is benefiting and is responsible for that sin too. It's ridiculous. And honestly, it is completely foreign to scripture, because now you're doing what the racists do, where now you are identifying groups of people, or you are identifying individuals with other individuals just because they look the same. It's ridiculous. It's actually quite racist, because you're saying because Jim Bob, right, from the 1800s may have been a racist.
Why you got to talk about my cousin like that?
Because Jim Bob from Alabama or something owned a slave and he was racist towards that black slave. You're saying that some Norwegian who's moved to America over the last 30 years is now responsible for that sin as well too. You are then judging that person and condemning that person because he's white. It's racist. On the other end, what about me? If other black people hurt white people, do I need then to repent for that person just because I'm black? That's racist, right? It's ridiculous. Now, which is why it goes back to what you said, Seth, about the importance of recognizing the covenantal aspects of corporate responsibility or the federal headship, because those things are, they're not, how do I say it? They're not, they really do define a group, right? So as a Ghanaian, well, I can't say me, but the president does represent Ghana, right? When the president goes to war, I am at war as well too, as a Ghanaian, right? That's unique. But as black people, it's just a skin color. So why is it that white people need to repent just because they look similarly to other white people? It's very, it's very divisive and destructive. It is not biblical at all, and it's very dangerous. So I am quite disappointed. And he said the same thing in front of an unbelieving crowd, where he didn't address the gospel, and he was asked a question about what would you say? He was asked this by an unbeliever, and it was, how should Christians react to racial justice? How should they achieve racial justice? And he essentially said, was mostly vague, and he said that I would just concur with everything that Brian Stevenson said. Now remember, Brian Stevenson in this panel discussion now he does some great work himself. If you don't know him, he is the man. I said there's a movie called Just Mercy recently.
Okay.
It's actually about him. So he does great work, in some cases anyway. When it comes to, he's a lawyer, he's doing some good work helping free innocent black men who have been put into jail. And he's doing great work there. Nevertheless, his ideology is not biblical when it comes to justice. And he's putting social justice and critical theory in this particular conversation. And then you have Mr. Keller saying he concurs with everything he says.
Well, yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think what I'm seeing here, you can tell me, I'm trying to whittle it down, and just get out of the details for a minute and kind of lift back up. But it seems like the way Keller has been doing this is he's taking biblical ideas and kind of really twisting them out of what they meant and getting it as close as he can to then take like a really, really fast run and try to leap from that to something that's currently cultural.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
And he's not really making it, but I think in post editing he's making the jump. If that makes sense. And so he's like, he's cashing this out as though it's biblical justice, but he's really distorting these biblical passages in favor of giving cover to people that are more leftist in their thinking.
That to be a great, sorry, go ahead.
No, what do you think? Is that an accurate?
Yeah, he wrote an article for the New York Times a couple of years ago where he essentially said that socialism is compatible with Christianity. He did say that. Now, he didn't say that he himself was a socialist. but that he mentioned that it's a long story. I won't get into it, but basically that he's a friend of his who ended up going to Scotland, and that friend of his saw these Scottish godly people who were very socialist, and he was shocked that you could have socialists who are very godly Christians. And this person then came out thinking that, well, I guess you can be a socialist and be Christian. Well, I would say to that, yes, you can be a socialist and be a Christian. Of course you can. In the same way, you can be a racist and be a Christian. In the same way, you can get an abortion and be a Christian. In the same way that David murdered another person, committed adultery, and yet was still a Christian. The point is, you can still do unbiblical things or believe unbiblical things for them generally, and still be a Christian. But the Bible says, "Thou shalt not steal," right? And even if now that applies to me, you, or politicians, right? It doesn't. Stealing is stealing, no matter who is doing it. So anyway, yes, he seems to be saying things where he is giving some a cover to pursue an unbiblical or leftist view on justice.
And these reasons that he's given for cover, just again, you just pointed this out, but I'm like, really? Like Tim Keller made that argument? Because, we've all had friends that have went somewhere and they were like, man, they're really good Christians, but they were this and did this unbiblical thing. Like, or, like, man, I can't believe I met these Christians and they're pro-gay. They affirm, pro-gay theology, but they're so loving. And none of us would say, oh man, it must be okay. We would all ask, is it biblical? Not, did you meet some person who has some good qualities, they're kind and nice, and they hold to false ideas? That argument in that very article, I was like, wow, I can't believe he put that forward with a straight face. Yeah. So anyways, I know we don't have a ton of time left, so let's just jump into kind of talking a little bit about the libertarian aspect, because he gives that spectrum, and all the way on the one side he has Marxism is in the parentheses, but it's postmodernism, which views justice in terms of power, he says. Then he says utilitarianism, which views power in terms of happiness. And then a little further over is liberalism, which views justice in terms of fairness. And then libertarianism, which views justice in terms of freedom. And then he gives a critique of each of them from a biblical perspective, he says. And you said he was a little unfair, which I thought he was unfair to libertarians as well. I told Nerva, I thought he set up a pretty weak straw man with libertarianism so he could take it down. And the part of that I really thought that he kind of missed out was this idea that any libertarian would argue that it was wholly on the person's merits themselves, the outcomes. So that word wholly, he said, it's biblically speaking, there's way more to a person. We're much more complicated. But to date, I haven't met any libertarian who wouldn't admit that same thing. So talk to us. What are your thoughts on his views about libertarians and how you would respond as a Christian libertarian?
Yeah. Now, if I remember correctly, he mentions that, as you were saying, that libertarians believe that poverty is, I'm struggling to remember, but I think it says that people can be poor just because, I'm trying to remember exactly how he phrased it.
Yeah, let me read it to you real quick. Actually, will you read it, babe? My voice is turning.
You got it. This view, recently argued by Robert Nozick, believes in a small number of individual rights, but not entitlements. Persons have the right not to be harmed, an absolute right to private property if fairly earned, and to the rights of free speech and free association. The first way to guard these rights is to have small government, since high taxes are unjust, a violation of the right to private property. And a large-scale government inevitably seeks to regulate speech, thought, and association.
And this next paragraph's important too. Go ahead.
Okay, the second way to guard these rights is to have an unregulated free market. The libertarian view is highly individualistic, based on implicit assumptions that every human being belongs to him or herself, and that the outcomes of anyone's life depend wholly on their individual choices and efforts.
Yeah.
And that's the part. So speak into that.
Of course, we don't believe that. Because I think he mentions that, there are there are several reasons why people can be wealthier or less
Right.
wealthy than others, and the different factors, we all recognize that, right? It could be something as like, you know, natural disasters, or just your parents, or just a number of random things. But libertarians, that's not what we believe at all. We just believe that people and society will flourish better if people are free to choose for themselves, and not just that. Not even just that. I want to be very careful how I say this, but as I said before, I'm a libertarian for two reasons. One, because I think it's more practical in some sense, but in another sense, I think it's also more biblical. Of all those options there, I really do believe it's a more biblical view. Because, for example, biblically, all the things that he mentioned there, the Mosaic Law is not against it, which is that every man is responsible for himself. The kings, the priests in Israel were not responsible for giving people entitlements, right? If you're going to receive any kind of entitlement, it would be from voluntary or private donations. So my basis for believing that freedom is best for society and best for individuals is based on the Mosaic Law, which does not give the government the authority to really have control over someone else's life. Now, of course, which, as you know, people should have the right to right to life, and liberty and property. And biblically, all those things is what's affirmed. There's nothing else in the Mosaic Law that would be directly against that.
That's good. And I think a key word you just used is more. Libertarianism is more in line with the implications of the Bible. And I think that's an important point that I'm like, man, I'm like, really, like, he seems to present this argument consistently, like if it's not a complete neat fit with any of these views of justice, therefore it's a free for all. And Nerva, you said this, you used this analogy the other day, like in telling someone, you know, when they're dating someone, like, yeah, you know, nobody's perfect, therefore your dating process doesn't really matter. Just marry whoever. Like, it don't matter what their background is, their character. Everybody's imperfect. Nobody's got great, you know, ideal character. Therefore, if someone just, you know, killed their sister last week, kicked their cat, and who cares, you know? And so it's this idea, this leap from not a neat fit. And I like, I'm gonna try to find this quote here. There was a article a while back that J.P. Moreland wrote on just arguing for a limited government from a biblical perspective. You know, he was acknowledging that some people, you know, people will often say Jesus wasn't Democrat or Republican. You know, he came not to take sides, but to take over, all that kind of stuff. And it all has an element of truth. And he said, but while Jesus is neither a Democrat nor Republican, there are things he taught about morality, the state, and the church, which a believer should factor into his political, social, and cultural thinking and practice. And some of these teachings of Jesus could favor one political party over another.
Absolutely.
And I think it's simple and to the point. It could favor an economic policy over another. It could favor a prison, and doesn't have to be a neat fit. Anything on that?
We're not called to implement the Mosaic Law or a theocracy in our society, although there are some Christians that I love who might disagree with that. I think they'd be wrong about that. So to me, then it's okay, how can we obey what we know to be true? And what I know is that the Mosaic Law gives us the groundwork for how to understand justice. And I just cannot fathom how an authoritarian nation would be in line with the Mosaic Law. With that being said, too, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are some things that are so clearly sinful. There are some things where it is very implied about how sinful it is or how impractical it is for a Christian. But even all then, and I'll be, you know, okay, so that tweet you mentioned earlier about the Marxism thing wasn't the only thing I had said in response to Tim Keller recently. I think about last week, he mentioned how essentially the Bible, very similar to what he's been saying before, very kind of vague language, giving credence to every kind of idea, where he was saying that the Bible isn't, you know what? Can I actually read it? I have it here somewhere. I don't
Yeah,
want to
yeah, go ahead.
Please.
very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
As
Love to hear it.
Christians and the freedom of conscience in politics. The Bible binds my conscience to care for the poor, but it does not tell me the best practical way to do it. Any practical strategy, high taxes and government services versus low taxes and private charity, may be good and wise, and may even be somewhat inferred from other things the Bible teaches, but they are not directly commanded, and therefore we cannot insist that all Christians, as a matter of conscience, follow one or the other. Actually, that's actually not the main thing I wanted to actually read, but we already addressed that. But then after that, I didn't leave it here. But after that, he talks about the exact same thing, but as it relates to abortion, where he's saying that concerning abortion, the Bible, abortion is evil, it's wrong, but the Bible does not give us how to. It doesn't tell us what policies we should support to end or decrease abortion. The word decrease there is very important. And you don't want to read too much into someone's thinking. I want to be faithful in loving him to not assume the worst. But given the context of it all, given that whole thread about saying you can vote essentially for different kind of policies concerning, either socialism or big government, all that kind of stuff, he seemed to be suggesting that you could support a pro-abortion politician as a Christian. Yeah. Because by doing that, because the idea is a very popular myth right now that I'm actually going to write about very soon, which is that pro-abortion politicians, especially the Democrats, that when they're in power, they actually decrease the rate of abortions in America. That's a myth. It's not true at all.
Okay.
Nevertheless, the idea that you can vote for a pro-abortion, a politician who believes it's justice. So I think it was just last night, Bernie Sanders mentioned that that abortion in America is a constitutional right.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
You would vote for someone that believes that murder is a constitutional right, a human right that pleases God? How? I always ask this. What if it's 5-year-olds that's being talked about? What if it's 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds? I would imagine it would be a no, like it's wrong to do that. Well, then why is it wrong? Which makes me concerned. I'm not saying this is true for Keller, because I believe him when he says that abortion is evil. I really do. But when you are suggesting things like that, you are then implying that the preborn baby's life isn't quite as important than as a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, because we're saying it's okay to kill babies.
Wow.
It's okay, and we will vote for that person. So now, it doesn't mean you have to vote for a pro-life person even. I wouldn't know why you wouldn't, but it doesn't mean you have to. But it doesn't mean that you should vote for someone who's actually a pro-abortion, pro-murder politician. And now we think that you can be a Christian and do so in good conscience, and he seemed to be saying that. And that's a concern. I say that because all this stuff here isn't just a matter of differences. Yeah. There are consequences to ideas. We're either going to be fostering and pursuing and establishing justice, or we're not, and we'll do the opposite. And again, I respect Keller. I am not as godly as he is. I am not as wise as he is. But on this issue here, he's wrong, and I think he's very dangerously and very, very divisively wrong.
Wow.
No, I think you're right about that, and that's well said. And I do think we're at a very, it's an intense time we're living in. It's a very important time. It's a tipping point moment, and I think we have to, many of us, look beyond even our favorites and say, man,
so true.
Let every man be a liar, but let God be true, and I think that in this case, I think he is, widely missed the mark and dangerously so, and giving cover to people feeling like they can consciously vote for not the side that's working for justice, but actually a side that's promoting injustice in the name of justice. Yeah. And that's what, if we are correct in our thought that biblical justice would work against socialism and would protect the basic rights of individual human beings, and that's the function of government, then at this point, at this stage in history, to vote for the party platform that the Democrats have ascribed to is to not only, it's not like he's positioning it to vote for another side of justice that's not represented in the Republican side. It's to actually vote for injustice. Yeah. And it's to vote against justice of a great degree where, like you said, I think that's part, it's like hard, if we haven't done much thinking about abortion, I don't know why it's easy. I guess the propaganda over the years has gotten to people, but they're able to separate it out. But you're right. If they were rounding up, you know, a million of a group of people per year and saying, we're going to legally allow them to be killed. Yeah. Can you imagine the outrage? Yeah. But we don't apply it consistently.
We are really we are basically the first generation of Christians that have embraced Marxism as a viable option for a Christian. Ooh. I've been reading a lot of Spurgeon on this issue, and he did not mince words on it. You know, remember that he was generally somewhat, I think was preaching in the 1860s or something like that, and generally then, which is, at the time, Marxism and socialism was was burgeoning a little bit in Britain. He did not mince words about it. He said it's a different philosophy. It is not compatible with Christianity. And of course, every time socialism has really been embraced by a political group or a nation, the first thing they go to is the church. They attack the church. And yet now you have many Christians who are either kind of linking socialism or who are embracing socialism, and that's a concern. You know, so either we have to make a choice here. There's only two possibilities. Either we are somehow living in a more just society. We understand justice better than I guess the last several, hundreds of years of Christianity when it comes to addressing this issue, or we're just now more unjust and unbiblical on this issue than they were. And unfortunately, I think it's the latter.
Man, I'm sorry, but I didn't let you talk much. Did you have any words you wanted to add?
No, I think good. This was awesome. And I love the fact that this was sort of a good, not exercise, but a good talk about just honoring the person, but critiquing and using your critical thinking and biblical understanding to assess, okay, this is in harmony with the kingdom. This is not in harmony. And unfortunately, like y'all said earlier, we are living in those times where even our favorites, even the biblical leaders and pastors, and you just have to be careful, and you've got to be in your scriptures for yourself and really understand the word and understand the times we're living in, because in this age of social media, I mean, tweeting something means it's truth, and that's just the biggest lie ever. Some of the biggest lies come through media, so just beware, be careful, and let's just be
about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sam. How can the listeners stay in touch with you?
They can find me on all social media platforms at slowtowrite.com. Sorry, at slow to write, I mean. They can go to my blog at slowtowrite.com. And then if they feel willing to check it out, I just started a Patreon a couple months ago. They can check out my Patreon too at Slow to Write. And that's
support. If you got that money,
yes,
go on and invest it in fertile ground, man. Because you are on the front lines. I follow, his Twitter. He's out there doing battle in an honoring way, but challenging people on a biblical basis. So awesome. Thank you so much, man, for spending this time with us today and helping us think through this a little more clearly.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me. I really enjoyed it.